I lost my last quid at probably about 2 o'clock in the morning, and I knew I was in trouble then because I had a significant amount of debt to pay off and I'd essentially stolen £8,000 off my boss. So I suppose ever since being a young kid, I was pretty good at sport. Rugby was the one thing that I always wanted to do. From sort of teenage years, people started to show an interest in coming watching me in terms of potentially to do something on a professional level. 18, I signed a 2-year professional contract at Leeds to join the academy system there, and it was great, and it was just another one of the long line of things that had gone according to plan for me, I suppose. In terms of the gambling side of things, it was nothing that I'd ever really been concerned about or was interested in. And when I joined the club, it was quite obvious that there was quite a big betting culture around the place. As you know, in sport and gambling have a lot of links, and there's a lot of sponsorship that goes on in the sport, and it just became more apparent that it was available, and it was something that a lot of the other boys did. And the first thing that got me involved in it was we used to have betting club on a Thursday afternoon. So our training schedule for the week would be we trained on a Thursday morning and we played on a Friday evening. So we'd finish training at lunchtime on a Thursday, all have a shower, have a coffee, go down to the bookies, all throw 20 quid each in and pretty much play with that, pool it together. If we won any money, we'd have a day out at the races or use it for a day out on to go drinking or whatever it was and socialising, and it was great. But that's what sort of got me involved and interested to a certain extent in horse racing and sports betting. Rugby-wise, everything went great. I broke into the first team at the end of my first year. At the start of my second year, I stayed in the team and I got a 3-year contract extension on a little bit better money, and everything was great, and it was all going according to plan again. And about 4 or 5 weeks after that, after I'd signed my deal, we played away on a Friday night, and just before half-time, I got spear tackled by a big Samoan guy, and I knew it was pretty bad. I was knocked out cold. I was in hospital then for 2 weeks, had a couple of operations, and I'd broke a little bone in my neck. I dislocated my shoulder and broke my collarbone, and I knew that I was going to be out injured for a significant period of time, and I was absolutely devastated because it was the first thing that had ever gone wrong and hadn't gone according to plan. And as was the case with a lot of lads who get injured, I found myself pretty bored pretty quickly, and I was looking for things to sort of entertain me and pass the time. And so it made sense to just use what I'd sort of understood in terms of betting to pass the time in terms of a little bit of entertainment. There was a Ladbroke shop about 500 yards away from where I lived. So every day after training, I'd go in and I'd call in and I'd put 20 quid over the counter on my odds-on card and then go home and basically play on the horses and sports for the rest of the day. Very low-level money, very small stakes. Nothing that was ever going to get me in terms of any debt. I never spent more than 50 quid a week, never lost more than 50 quid. And I kind of did that for a period of time of around 6 months, and everything was fine. And it was great, to be honest. I actually passed the time really well in the first part of my injury. And then I suppose the day came when everything changed, in the fact that I woke up one morning and one of the boys from the club rang me up and essentially gave me a tip on a horse. He said it was going to win and to get some money on it. So as you do, I went down to the betting shop and I asked how much I had in my betting account, and the lady behind the counter said I had 52 quid. So I put £30 on this horse, and at the time it was 25 to 1. It was the biggest bet that I'd ever had at that stage, and I used the other 22 quid that I had left over to put it in an accumulator. So I put my slips in my pocket, went off to training, did what I had to do. Obviously went down to the betting shop to watch the race of the tip, and it duly won by about 10 lengths, and I knew I'd won 780 quid from my £30 bet, which, as you can imagine, as a 19-year-old kid, I was absolutely buzzing. It was certainly the biggest amount that I'd ever won. And I recorded the racing and watched all the racing, and as it turned out, my accumulator also came in. So essentially, at that day, at 19 years old, I turned £52 into 11,680. And as you can imagine, I was absolutely buzzing. It was the greatest feeling that I'd ever had. 20 years later almost, I'm sat here nearly 40 years of age, and sadly it probably still is the greatest feeling that I've ever had. It was the first time that I'd ever won a significant amount of money, and I think that changed everything in terms of my outlook on betting. It changed the level of my stakes, it changed the frequency that I gambled. I was excited to come home after training every day because I suddenly had so much money in my betting account. And the day after, I ran down to the bookies and I gave them my bet slips, expecting them to pay me out all this money, and they didn't have that kind of money in the shop. So I took 1,500 and left 10,240 in my betting account. And I rang my mate who'd given me the tip, and he gave me another horse, and he said, look, he said, I think this is going to win as well. He said, don't go silly on it, but have a go on it. And I looked on my betting app on my phone and I had 10,240 quid. So I put 240 quid on it, and that duly won as well. And 2 hours later, I'd won another 2,000 quid. So in that space of that 20 hours, I'd basically turned 50 quid into 14 grand. And that just did everything in terms of changing the way I looked at things. The £240 I put on that horse became standard practice. So I started to put that on every bet. £200 wins on horses, £300 doubles on football bets, because I could, because it wasn't my money. I thought I was probably going to win more every day. And as is normally the case, that didn't happen. And 6 months later, after doing a similar sort of thing every single day, I had run out of the money. And that's when I started to find it really hard in terms of the level that I needed to bet, because I had to start using my own money. And obviously as a young man, I wasn't earning a significant amount of money, but I still wanted to place the high level of bets that I've been doing. But the longer it went, the quicker and quicker I was running out of money at the end of every month. So I started to look for other ways of credit, and I got a credit card because I could. And I used that to play with for a couple of months, and then I got a loan because I could, and then I got another one and another one, and basically 2 years down the line, if you fast forward, I hadn't played another game of rugby because it took me ages to get fit, and when I did, I was in no condition to play. And I built up debts of 65 grand on credit cards and loans because I'd pretty much gambled every day for that 2 years. And other things started to happen life-wise, and at the end of every season we'd go on holidays and I couldn't afford to. So I sort of started to borrow money off my dad and get more credit cards and more loans to cover that sort of thing. And I went on a trip to Ireland, and as you do as a young man at the end of the season, we were enjoying ourselves, and we went drinking and played a few games of golf, and I met a girl who got on well with, and we stayed in touch when I came home. And about a month later, one of the boys was getting married at my club, so I invited her over for the weekend because we'd got on well, and she did, and she came over Friday and Saturday, and she went home Sunday, and as it turned out, at sort of 24 years of age, I got her pregnant. I was in masses of debt with no real job opportunities and 2 kids on the way with a girl that essentially lived in a different country. At the end of that season, I wasn't going to get my contract renewed because why would I? Because I hadn't played any games of any significance for over 2 years. But I knew I needed to do something, because any sort of decent human being would need to find a way of ensuring that I could look after my partner and kids. So I eventually signed a contract to go to a club in Ireland for 3 years because it made sense. It was the right thing to do. I would go over and we would live together and have the kids and live happily ever after, ideally. And for the last 6 months of my contract in England, I basically tried to save as much money as I could so I could bring over with me. As it turned out, I didn't save a penny, because every penny that I got, I gambled to try and win more. And the debt that I'd built up, I just stopped paying. And the day I left, I got my final pay from the club. Pretty much, I had 700 quid left to my name from 5 years full-time rugby. And I left England with debts of 72 grand because I hadn't paid any of my debts for the last 6 months of being here. On the way to the airport, I lost the 700 quid that I had to my name in William Hill. And I actually got on the plane, I couldn't even afford a bottle of water. And when I arrived in Dublin, my missus picked me up from the airport. I told her I lost my wallet and basically cracked on from there. Started off on a lie. I actually had quite a lot going on for the first couple of months of being in Ireland, which enabled me to not have to think about betting. But the more and more time passed, the more I knew I wanted to go in. And probably 2 months was about as much as I could take before I went in and I put a £20 bet on a horse. And then another one, and then about a week later I won 900 quid on a football acca, and that was it. I was back up and running, and very quickly the same old behaviour started to reappear, and I put the 900 quid in 2 betting accounts so my missus wouldn't have to find out that I was taking money out of our bank accounts. And the way it worked in our house was that I had my bank account, which I got my salary paid into, and she had hers, and we had a joint account which we paid the bills out of. And very quickly I started to lose my money and have to look for other means. And I got a couple of little bits of credit, which didn't last me very long. And it wasn't long before I started to dip into our savings account to cover my losses in effect. And as you can imagine, it wasn't long before debt started to appear and bills stopped getting paid, and I had to start covering my tracks. And the longer and more time went by, the more and more I had to do it, and the more and more I was dipping into the savings account. And subsequently, we started to get phone calls from people who were looking for money off us because bills weren't getting paid. I started to get letters to the door, and I had to start doing things to hide my behaviours from her quite quickly. And that involved me pulling the house phone cord out the wall before I went to training, because I knew nobody could ring her and ask for money, and I would plug it back in when I got home. I changed my mobile phone number 2 or 3 times in the space of a year. I suppose the worst one was I used to pay the postman £200 a month to not put mail through my door. I used to meet the postman at the end of my road, which is about half a mile long. He would keep my mail in an elastic band, and basically I would pay him to be able to go through it in front of him and take away anything that was incriminating. And those are the kind of things that I did to be able to carry on doing what I was doing for such a long period of time. Probably a few months after that, a bailiff came to our house and basically gave us an eviction notice for our house because I hadn't paid the mortgage for months and months. And I basically knew I had sort of 4 or 5 days to pay off a debt of over £6,000. Straight away, I tried to look for ways of getting the money together to pay it. The only way I knew how to get any money was to try and win it, because it's all I ever knew. And at the time, I had £42 left in my bank account, so I tried to win it with that. It didn't work. And ultimately, I ended up going to the club and the chairman and asking him to lend me some money. And he was a lovely guy, and he basically asked me what I wanted it for. And so I told him I was selling our house in England and I needed to pay the solicitor's fees to cover that, to get the equity out of the house as quick as possible. And I didn't even own a house in the UK. I just thought that was the most reasonable way of getting it. And I asked him for £6,000, and he basically said he could get it to me, but it might take him a week or so because he had to clear it with the other directors and trustees. But in the meantime, he was such a nice guy that he personally lent me £2,000 out of his own money. And I duly went straight to the bookies with it, because my first port of call was thinking, I can easily make this £2,000 into 6 in the bookies. And I think that was always the issue. I knew I could win because I won £14,000 when I was a kid. And I took the £2,000 and I tried to win the 6 to pay off my mortgage, and I got it up to £4,000 at one stage and then lost it. On Thursday after training, I was just in absolute bits. I didn't have any way of getting the money. The only way I thought I could get the money together was to finish training, have a shower, go and speak to the chairman and see if he could basically give me the other £4,000. And I would hope that that would be sufficient for the bank to allow me a bit more time. I finished my training, went for a shower, went up to the office, knocked on the chairman's door, and he wasn't in. After ringing the receptionist and asking was he around, and basically telling me no, he'd gone to Dublin for a meeting and he wouldn't be back till the game day tomorrow, I was just devastated. And I was walking out thinking, oh my God, what am I going to do about this? And as I walked past his office, I basically took the decision to go back in, and I took his checkbook out of his top drawer, ripped 2 cheques out of the top, I put it back and went home. And I took the decision to take the money. And I went down to a local post office and I cashed 2 cheques for worth £8,000 for £4,000 each, and walked out of the post office with £7,700 in cash. At no point did I ever think I was really doing anything wrong, if I'm honest, because I was so deluded at the time, and my moral compass had gone so much because of what I got involved in, that I thought this was the best way of keeping everyone happy. And it was my intention to pay him back. I went into the bank and I fed a sob story to the guy at the bank, and I ended up only having to pay half of what I owed for my mortgage. Bought myself another 30 days to pay that off, and walked out of the bank with still 4,700 basically in cash. And I took that £5,000 and went straight into Paddy Power, put it in my betting account, and basically went home with the idea that I would win enough money to pay off everything. I got a pen and paper out on a notepad and my laptop, and I wrote down how much I needed to win there and then to basically solve all my problems. And I worked it out that I needed 13,300, which was £8,000 to pay back to the chairman, 3,000 more to pay off the rest of my mortgage, and a few £100 for other bits here and there. And I rang my mate who had a stud farm and got some information on horses from him. I put £2,000 on a horse and that one. Put 1,500 on another horse and that one. Basically, after a couple of hours of gambling, I'd got my account up to €14,511.40, which was enough to do what I needed to do. So my plan of attack was to put some money on the last horse that he gave us and then cash it out, pay off my debts and still have money left in my betting account, which for me would have been an ideal scenario. I put 4,511.40 on a horse to leave exactly 10 grand in my betting account. And if and when it won, I would have won 12.5 grand and had 22.5 grand in my betting account. And as it happened, it jumped the last fence in front, and about 200 yards from the line, its back leg slipped and the jockey fell off and basically cost me 12.5 grand, which, as you can imagine, I wasn't overly pleased about. And I smashed my dinner plate against the wall and basically went mad. I think it would have been worse if I hadn't had money left over in my betting account, but because I had 10 grand left, it actually didn't seem like it was that big of a deal. So I carried on playing because 10 grand wasn't quite enough in terms of what I needed. After, I'd say, another 30 bets on horses and 10 bets on football and other sports, I lost another 8.5 grand and I was down to £1,500. And I went to bed that night, and as soon as my missus fell asleep, I basically rolled out of bed, went back downstairs, put my laptop on in the dark on mute, and put my last £1,500 on a baseball match in America, not knowing the rules, not knowing what was going on, never watched it before, had no interest in it, but it was what was available. So I put my last £1,500 on it and it lost. And I knew I was in trouble then because I had a significant amount of debt to pay off and I'd essentially stolen 8 grand off my boss. 2 weeks later, I got a phone call from the club. I went down knowing what was going to happen, but I tried to think that it would be something different. And as I got to the club, I walked in on everyone's day off. And I was met basically by a chairman, a director and a policeman stood behind the table. And on the table in front of me was a CCTV picture of myself cashing the cheque. And he basically looked at me and went, "Why did you steal from me?" I didn't know what to say because I was absolutely mortified, as you can imagine. I had to say, look, I'm in a significant amount of debt and I used the money to try and win enough money to pay everything off, but it hasn't gone the way I wanted it to, and I'm really sorry, but I will pay you back as soon as I can. To which I got sacked, and then I had to go with a policeman down to Longford Garda Station, where I was charged with theft and fraud and forgery and bailed to appear at Longford Magistrates Court in 10 days. And I got in the car to drive home, basically thinking, what on earth am I going to tell my missus? And I just couldn't think of anything decent to tell her, so I just didn't. And for the next 10 days before the court, I just put my training kit on every morning and went out at normal time and came back at normal time, because my intention was to get to the day of the court, find out what was happening, reassess, get a job, play part-time rugby and basically go from there. The only thing I did in that period of time was I went to Dublin and I borrowed 15 grand off a gangster, knowing exactly what the consequences of that was if I didn't pay him back. But I just didn't care because I needed the money there and then. And I turned up at the court and I walked in and I pleaded guilty as was planned. And it was adjourned for 5 months to reappear at Longford Circuit Court, it is called in Ireland, to get my sentencing. And I thought that was quite a good result. I'd bought myself another 5 months in which I had to get the money together to pay off the debt and do something productive. And the judge basically said to me on the way out of the court that I strongly suggest you repay the debt and do that, because if you don't, then you're looking at a prison sentence. I walked out of the court thinking that wasn't a bad result. When I turned left to get in my car, there was press and media stood waiting for me, and they started taking snaps and trying to stick a microphone under my mouth. And I just completely panicked, jumped in the car and sped off home, knowing that it was about to come out what I'd done and I probably couldn't keep it a secret for any longer. I rang my missus on the way home and asked her where she was, and she was at a play centre with the kids. So I just went home and pretty much packed a bag, got my passport, went to the airport and flew back to England. I just went and sat in my mate's house and said to him, look, I'm in quite a lot of trouble here, and at some point in the next few hours I'm going to get a phone call and it isn't going to be very pretty. At about 8 o'clock the next morning, where my missus rang me and I answered it, and she went absolutely mental down the phone saying that I was the worst bloke in the world. I wasn't allowed to see the kids ever again. I wasn't welcome back in the house. And as it turned out, she found out what I did in the Daily Star, which isn't great because I just didn't have the courage, I suppose, to stand in front of her and tell her what I've been doing. Because all the way through my betting, I just never dealt with anything in the right way, and I always tried to run away from things. And I then had to go and see my parents and basically tell them that I'd been kicked out by my missus, I wasn't allowed to see my kids, and I had a 10 grand debt to pay off to a court in 5 months. But actually that wasn't the biggest issue because I had a 15 grand debt to pay to a gangster, and if I didn't pay it ASAP, probably wasn't going to be around for the court case. They let me in basically because they had to, and I had nowhere else to go. From then on, I was probably very lucky that I had one of my best mates in Ireland contacted me, and we had a conversation, and due to what I told him, he basically said he couldn't live with himself knowing what was going to happen, and he went and paid him off for me and solved that problem, for which I was obviously really grateful. That left me with the court case to sort out, and for the few months that I was back in England, I played some part-time rugby, and I got a job with the rugby club to earn the money that I needed to earn to pay off my debt. And I had to get my money paid into my mum's account because when I tried to open a bank account, I just couldn't get one because of all the debt that I'd left in England the last time. So every time my mum got paid, she would send the money to the court and whatever was left to my missus, and I was apparently living off 20 quid a week while I was here, but actually I was getting some extra cash from the club, and I was using that to place bets with out of town in betting shops because I couldn't do it online anymore, but I needed to carry on doing it, even though I knew betting was causing me harm and it was creating all these problems for me at that stage. It was just something that I had to do, and I never felt comfortable if I wasn't able to do it. The day of the court arrived and I had the money paid off. The judge stood up and he referred to the policeman who gave us a decent report because I'd pleaded guilty and held my hands up straight away. They recounted the fact that I'd paid off the debt, and then they basically got towards my betting statements because I'd revealed to the chairman and the policeman that actually I'd took the money to try and win enough money to pay off all my debts. I got Ladbrokes and Paddy Power to provide 12 months betting statements leading up to the day I got arrested. And both me and my dad sort of thought that I'd spent about 150 grand in the 12 months. And as it turned out, over the 12-month period leading up to my arrest, I'd gambled 1.17 million and lost 123 grand over 2 separate betting accounts. The 123 grand that I lost was 53 grand more than the entire amount of income that came into our house in that year. And I genuinely think that's what kept me out of prison, because the judge said he'd never seen anything like it and he couldn't understand how that was even possible. And I ended up getting a 3-year suspended sentence and 200 hours community service because I paid off the debt and I'd showed that clearly I hadn't took the money to go on holiday or buy a car or something like that. And actually the whole betting account thing was a significant thing that prevented me from going to prison. I left the court basically pretty happy that I hadn't had to serve a prison sentence, but still with a lot of things I needed to sort out. And I went to see my missus and just apologised to her. I hadn't spoken to her for months, hadn't seen the kids, missed my daughter's birth, terrible stuff. And I went to her and I just said, look, I said, I'm really sorry about what's happened. I've paid off the debt, I haven't gone to prison, I have a job in England, I'm playing rugby part-time in England. I don't expect you to come, but it would be great if you did. She agreed to come over on a trial basis, which she did, and she came for 6 months. In return for her coming, I sort of gave her access to all of the money. She paid all the bills, she did all the shopping, she had access to everything. If I wanted money, I'd ask for it, and that was fine because I would have done anything for him to come over. And after about 6 months of no issues at all, she went back to Ireland for a few days to see her parents and took the kids. And while she was away, I just couldn't keep myself from betting, but I didn't have any way of getting money at that stage. I got up on a Tuesday morning and I went into St Helens town centre and I pawned her engagement ring and all of my kids' stuff, PlayStation and games, for 500 quid because I thought I was going to win enough money to buy them back before she came home. And I went and I put my 500 quid in a betting account and I went home, placed my 500 quid's worth of bets and watched them all lose. And when I lost my last quid, I went absolutely mental, smashed my house to pieces. When I'd finished smashing everything in the house, I just sat on the couch as angry as you can possibly be. And then I just sort of was sat there looking at my broken house, thinking, oh my God, what on earth are you doing? And I think that was That was January 2013, and I've been doing this sort of stuff since 1999, and it was the first ever time that I thought, I don't want to do this anymore, but I just didn't know how to stop. My rugby career had gone down the pan massively. I had no trust from anyone. I couldn't stop telling lies. I couldn't stop betting. I was in masses of debt. The Thursday before she came home on a Friday back from Ireland, I basically didn't know what to do or what I could do. I drove down to a local train station called Fatto Heath and sat on the bridge for 2.5 hours and tried to psych myself up to jump off it. I remember thinking that I didn't want to do it, but I also remember thinking that I didn't want to have to deal with what I knew was coming. I ended up getting down and driving to my parents' house, knocking on the door in the middle of the night and basically saying to my mum, I need to talk to you. And I told her everything that I'd ever done. I told her the truth about all of the things from Ireland, all of the things that I'd done in England, and that I wanted to stop, but I didn't know how. And then she basically sent me to bed and woke me up in the morning and basically said, get dressed, you're going to get some help. She'd been Googling treatment facilities and came across one called Sporting Chance Clinic, which was for sportsmen who had issues with drinking, drugs, gambling, whatever it was. And she'd contacted them and basically they agreed to take me. And in return for me going to get some help, she went down back into town and bought the things that I'd sold from my house and tidied up my house and went and picked my missus up from the airport and told her where I'd gone. And I went in January 2013, 5 weeks, counselling, psychotherapy, learning to understand the reasons why I did what I did. And I think that was the biggest thing for me that I found, is learning to understand. As a sportsman, I was a really competitive guy and I didn't like to lose. And when I started to lose, when I was betting, I didn't enjoy it and I wanted to get back to zero and out of debt. And the more I tried that, the further in debt I got. Getting injured and missing out on the adrenaline, the ups and downs of what I needed to get out of sport was another big thing. And actually I found betting replicated that. And when I was injured and looking for other means of entertainment, I found it. And unfortunately, it was something that I could never get a lid on and understand what it meant. And obviously winning 14 grand in the space of a day changed my outlook on it, changed the amount I gambled, changed the amount of time I spent gambling, just changed everything. And I never ever learned what that meant and how to navigate myself away from it, I suppose. And unfortunately, it took an ended career, an almost broken marriage, almost 12 months away from my kids, missed my daughter's birth, significant amount of debt, to understand that this wasn't the way forward. And fortunately, since then, I've been able to rebuild those relationships and understand that there's better things that you can do with your time and your money. I am in a fortunate place now that I work for a company that I can help ensure other people don't do the same things that I did and fall into the same sort of pitfalls. To be able to share that and create a positive from a negative, I suppose, is something that I'm really grateful for.